This is the Atmospheric Rivers module. I'm Ed Zoke, and Dan Bykos and I put this training together. Here are the learning objectives for this module. We will show how to make optimal use of GOES-R imagery and baseline products in identification and tracking of atmospheric rivers. The baseline product is the LAP TPW product, and the imagery, the new water vapor channels on GOES-R. In this lesson, we will use Imagery satellite imagery as a proxy for GOES-R to show products and imagery for a developing atmospheric river over the Pacific in mid-February 2016. This case eventually brought significant precipitation to the West Coast. First, let's review the definition of an atmospheric river. It is a relatively narrow swath of high moisture extending from the tropics or subtropics into mid-latitudes. And these atmospheric rivers can lead to significant precipitation events. Most well known are the ones that go from Hawaii onto the west coast, the so-called Pineapple Express, but atmospheric rivers can be found from the Gulf of Mexico or other parts of the Atlantic, and sometimes they're enhanced by moisture from a tropical system, in which case you can get significant flooding, and the effects can extend far inland. For reference, there's a comment module on atmospheric rivers and a NOAA website that has much more information. How can we diagnose an atmospheric river now? Well, qualitatively, we can use the single water vapor channel available on GOES. For those on the West Coast, sounder-based water vapor imagery from GOES 15 does have all three channels that will be available on GOES-R, however the resolution is quite low. Quantitatively, we can use satellite products that measure TPW, such as the NOAA operational blended product, which uses microwave instruments aboard polar orbiting satellites, blended with GPS measurements. The advantage is we can see through clouds. The disadvantage is in time resolution, although this is improving. The current product on AWIPS is TPW, but a layered product is being tested at some WFOs. And next we'll show a loop of the blended TPW product as it appears on AWIPS. Here is an example of how the NOAA blended TPW product appears on AWIPS for a strong atmospheric river case in late November to early December 2012. We have overlaid 850 millibar winds from the GFS in this loop. How might we diagnose an atmospheric river in the GOES-R era? In terms of water vapor imagery, of course, we will have three water vapor channels instead of the single channel we have now with GOES. As far as quantitative observation of total precipitable water, while GOES-R does not have the same instrumentation as the polar orbiters for generating a blended TPW product, a method has been developed to derive TPW from the GOES-R channels. The product is called the Legacy Atmospheric Profile, or LAP, Precipitable Water Baseline Product, which we will discuss in the next slide. More details on all the GOES-R LAP products can be found in an earlier module. Here is the LAP TPW baseline product using Imagery data as a proxy for GOES-R. We are looking at the total precipitable water across the Pacific for a single time during this case. You will notice that there is a data mask shown on the right side. We have identified cloudy and clear areas and an area where GFS is used. This is because, unlike the NOAA blended TPW product, this product cannot see through clouds, so we have this data or cloud mask. Under clear skies, you can have successful retrievals, and under cloudy conditions where the clouds are thin cirrus, successful retrievals are also possible. But under otherwise cloudy conditions, retrievals cannot be made, and the GFS is used to fill in the data. So this is considered a blended product between model and satellite. Here is how the LAP TPW product would appear on AWIPS. The scale in the top is in inches. Here is a loop of the LAP TPW baseline product for the same area of the mid-Pacific Ocean, southern mid-Pacific Ocean that we saw in the previous slide. Our loop runs from 0Z on the 11th of February to 18Z on the 12th. It is at 6-hour intervals. Of course, in the GOES-R error, you'll be able to have this product every 5 minutes, but for a feature like an atmospheric river, which is slower to develop, a 6-hour loop, in this case, is preferred to show the developing features. Here is the same loop, but with some of the features annotated. The thin plume of higher PW extending from southwest to northeast is associated with an advancing trough and its cold front. We've marked this by red arrows at the beginning of the loop. Note the very dry air behind this frontal zone. Our developing atmospheric river is marked by the northward advancing plume of higher PW air from the south. This is within the blue oval. Note the dry slot of air between these two features. Over time, the moisture from the south gets drawn up into the eastward advancing frontal zone, and together these form the atmospheric river that eventually moves on to the west coast and produces the heavy precipitation. Next, we'll see how these features look with the 3 water vapor channels. This channel is closest to what we now have in GOES. Recall from the GOES-R water vapor module that the weighting function for this channel generally lies between 400 to 600 millibars, or slightly lower than what we now have on GOES, so a little lower than the current GOES water vapor channel. The loop shown here and in the next 2 slides covers the same time period as the LAP TPW loop just shown, with an image every 6 hours, and it also covers the same area of the Pacific Ocean. So what do we see in this loop? The most obvious feature is the plume of moisture that moves at first northwards and then off to the northeast, corresponding to the high TPW plume that we saw in the LAP imagery. On the other hand, the zone of drier air between this feature and the frontal zone does not stand out very well in this channel of the water vapor imagery. We also do not readily see the moisture associated with the frontal zone itself, except off to the northeast portion of the image toward the end of the loop. This is the 7.35 micron channel that senses the lowest in the atmosphere, with a relatively broad weighting function that peaks near 700 millibars. Initially, there is very dry air shown by the warm brightness temperatures extending from west to east across the domain. Over the course of the loop, this area of dry air decreases as the frontal zone pushes south and east, and our plume of moisture associated with the developing atmospheric river moves initially to the northwest and then in a narrower plume to the northeast ahead of the frontal zone. The moisture associated with the frontal zone itself shows up better in this low-level water vapor imagery, though it is still not as obvious as the atmospheric river plume. Lastly, we have the high-level water vapor channel, with a weighting function that peaks generally in the 300 to 400 millibar level range, which is somewhat higher than the current GOES water vapor channel. We note a plume of colder brightness temperatures extending off to the northeast with time, coincident with our atmospheric river moisture plume that is reaching to higher levels. Since we see the plume of moisture in all 3 water vapor channels, we can imply that it extends over time through a deep layer of the atmosphere. One could look at all 3 water vapor channels at the same time using the 4-panel capability on AWIPS 2. In this loop, again covering the same time period as in the loop shown previously, we have placed an IR image in the lower right panel. Here we see the value of the water vapor imagery to diagnose our developing atmospheric river. We certainly do not get the sense of northward moisture transport from the tropics from the IR imagery alone. Another point to note with the IR imagery is that the clouds along the frontal zone have fairly warm brightness temperatures, indicating that at this point only shallow convection is found with the cold front. This explains why we could not see the frontal moisture in the mid and high level water vapor bands. Now let's look at one time only, about midway through the loops we just examined, and this time with a visible image in the lower right panel. The visible image nicely depicts the frontal zone and the cellular convection behind it, but not much about our developing atmospheric river. In terms of our developing atmospheric river plume, The more westward bulging of the tropical moisture is most clearly seen in the lower level water vapor imagery, with a fairly sharp edge marked by the light green arrows. The yellow arrow in each of the water vapor images marks the plume of moisture with our developing AR that is extending off to the northeast. Note how it is bringing moisture northward into what otherwise is a very dry atmosphere, as noted by the warmer brightness temperatures in all three water vapor bands present to the northeast of the yellow arrow. In summary, the new water vapor channels and LAP TPW product will aid in identifying atmospheric rivers in the GOES-R era.